Hi everyone, we will be starting the webinar in a couple of minutes, so hold on tight. Thank you. Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar, The Frog and the Butler, CI Pipelines for Modern DevOps. For audio quality purposes, your mics will be muted, but if you do have questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A tab and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. This webinar is recorded, so please be sure to look out for the recording in a couple of days. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce JFrog developer advocate, Baruch Sadagursky.
Hi, Pearl, thank you very much, and hello everybody, and welcome to our webinar. Today we are going to talk about the Frog and the Butler, and that means JFrog and Jenkins integration. My name is Baruch. I'm developer advocate with JFrog and at JBaruch on Twitter. By all means, feel free to connect with me here and continue the discussion. But also, as Pearl already mentioned, the Q&A panel is there for you, so feel free to ask any questions during the webinar. I will try to answer to as many as possible during the towards the end of the webinar, and everything else will be answered offline. Also, this webinar is recorded and streamed live on YouTube, so you will get the live YouTube video just the second this webinar ends. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Butler. We're going to talk about JFrog and with them together. Quick overview of JFrog Artifactory. JFrog Artifactory as a system of record and why it is important to have one when you build your CI pipeline. And demo JFrog Artifactory and Jenkins Pipeline integration and number of demos actually. So we have a lot to talk about today, and hopefully the time will allow us to take a lot of questions in the end as well. We are going to start with a poll, so let me bring it up. Here you go. You should see it by now. And I would like to understand where you stand in terms of familiarity with JFrog Artifactory, since that's the most integration we are going to talk about today, and just to know which level of I should target off, which level of usage. Just a couple of more seconds. Okay, so I think we can close it by now. I think we got the idea. And of course, as expected, you didn't make it easy for me. Um, you have a very nice bell curve distribution of users between all the types, which is fine. Which is fine. I truly believe that all of you will learn something today. So let's start with the big picture. Let's start with your development process, which includes continuous integration and continuous development. And as you obviously understand, everything starts with the development team, and development team writes code. They write code in bunch of their languages that they use, and then they add new dependencies if they have any need the new dependencies in whatever dependency manager and build tool that they are using. So if we have if we have Java builds, they will use Gradle and Maven and maybe Ivy. If they have .NET, they will use NuGet as their dependency management, NPM and Bower for JavaScript, obviously Ruby gems for Ruby, etc., etc. And if those developers, if those software engineers are actually more on an operations side of the house, they will use other dependency managers such as RPM, Docker, Vagrant, Debian, etc., etc. But the concept is the same. You need something new to be productive and write your code. You will bring a new dependency into the mix. And the first thing, of course, you do as a software developer or software engineer, you test it locally. You run the build locally. And once you run the build locally, those build tools and dependency managers will try to resolve dependencies from their declared remote repositories. And if you use a proper artifact repository like Artifactory, this remote repository will be your in-house artifact repository Artifactory. And if the artifacts are already there, they will be successfully resolved, of course. In any other case, the resolution will occur automatically from the remote repositories. Whatever remote repositories exist, can be JCenter or Maven Central for Java, it can be it can be Bintray or NPM Registry for NPM, or the canonical repositories for Ubuntu, etc., etc., whatever remote repositories, and all the artifacts will be cached in Artifactory. So once this is done, next step will be deploying the committing the changes, including the descriptors of the new dependencies to version control, whether you use Git or maybe GitHub or Bitbucket or any other CI server. This is where you commit your code. Next, once your code is committed, this is where the CI servers kick in, and any kind of CI server. But today we're, of course, obviously going to talk about Jenkins, but it's actually true for any CI server. It could be TeamCity, Bamboo, or some of the cloud ones like Travis CI, Drone.io, CodeShip. Doesn't matter. The concept is the same. The source code is checked out, and then the CI server runs exactly the same build by using exactly the same tools. So again, we have the same build running and actually resolving the same dependencies. And once the same dependencies are resolved, they will be resolved from the repository, from Artifactory, which by then already have all those repositories, all those artifacts cached. So of course the build will be much faster. And once this is done, once they are resolved and the build is successfully completed, the produced modules and the build info bill of materials is deployed back to Artifactory. And this is very important, and we will spend a lot of time today talking about this stage of deployment and generating and deploying the build of materials, because this is a very central piece of your trust in your continuous integration flow. Next, the promotion pipeline starts. You have external tools that contribute metadata to this build, and it can be QA tools like UI tests or integration tests, automatic stress tests, behavioral tests, or manual QA, whatever contributes metadata about the quality of those artifacts and promotes them through your pipeline. And once this is done, your code is ready to be deployed to production, if we're talking about deployable code. And then tools like Chef, Puppet, Ansible, Salt will take the code and deploy them to your servers locally or to your environments in the cloud. And if your code, if your software is downloadable and not deployable, then it will be rolled out to distribution and distributed to the end user, being it people, machines, IoT devices, or any other edge edge server or edge client that receives those updates and those packages. So today we are going to talk about the part of this big image, and truly we are going to talk about that, right? We are going to talk about CI servers, namely Jenkins, how it integrates with Artifactory, and how we build a promotion pipeline around it. And the promotion pipeline, as I already mentioned, is the process of taking those artifacts that the CI server built and taking them through a set of checks that actually promote them from one repository to another. That's a diagram that I personally find very well, very descriptive of how the promotion pipeline looks like. It's by Michael Huterman from the wonderful book Agile ILM, and you can see here exactly what's happening. So you can see here that you have this development environment central. This is where the code is deployed after it was first created, and then it got promoted through different repositories. Sorry about that. Through different repositories, through across those quality gates, and those are checks, right? So that can be a unit check, and this will be an integration test, and this will be stress test, and this will be manual QA, etc., etc. So basically, it promotes them through those gates, one after another. And today we're going to do that as well. Now, before we dive into Jenkins again, I will run a short poll to make sure what level of Jenkins familiarity you have. So let me launch that. And in the meanwhile, I see that someone asked the results of the poll previously. So let me see if I can actually share it with you, I guess after this one. So what we're going to do, we're going to finish this poll, and then I will show you the result of both of them. Okay, that's stable already. So let me add the poll and share the results. And you can see here that we have some people that never heard about Jenkins, and we're glad that they're here. We are going to show them some Jenkins today. And some people that the majority of people use Jenkins 2 with pipelines, so it will be right to your alley. And again, the majority of people use the Artifactory Jenkins plugin as well. Let me see if I can show you the results of the previous one. Yep, I can share it. So here, this is the first poll of how are you familiar with Artifactory, and here you can see that most of the people use Artifactory with multiple package types. Yay, and that's great because the whole idea of Artifactory being universal is allowing you to do that. We also see that a lot of people use the build integration. This is what we are going to talk about today, and hopefully we'll show you some new tricks. And a very good amount of people use the enterprise features as well. So this is all just great. Okay, so getting back to the slides, today we're going to talk about Artifactory Jenkins plugin mainly and how it works, and a little bit of integration of X-Ray with Jenkins as well. So for those of you who are not familiar, this is the main the heart of the integration between Jenkins and Artifactory. This is where all the magic happens. As you can see, we broke the graph of downloads. It went through 10,000 and then disappeared into infinity, probably, which is a good thing. So yeah, it is that popular, and this is awesome. And today I will show you how it actually should be used. Before we're going there, let's talk a little bit about the swing in the CI servers configuration that we experienced in the last 15 years. And that will explain why we love the Jenkins Pipeline plugin so much. But before we go there, let's start with a little bit of history. So cruise control, anyone? I guess there are some old guys like me that actually remember that. And as you can see here on the left side, the horror of the XML configuration. Yeah, it was that horrible, and that's why Jenkins came to exist. And 2005, 4 years after after we suffered 4 years with cruise control, Suki Kawagachi developed this great CI server, which is still the most popular CI server in the world, called a Hudson back then. And with Hudson, the configuration looked and with Jenkins, it still does like that. And you can see here a lot of checkboxes, etc. Some list that drop down, some text fields that you populate, and that's basically how you used to use Jenkins, Hudson, and then Jenkins for the last 10 years. And of course, that was like kind of a counter reaction for the horrors of XML in cruise control, but this approach has some downsides as well. And the most of them, it's not flexible enough. So for example, if I want to make some stages in my build conditional, there is no real easy way to do that. Working with processing some inputs to generate some outputs is not something actually supported. Those configurations weren't versionable, at least not by design. You can hack around it. You can go to, get to Jenkins home and find the XMLs which actually back up those forms and try to version them, but it's not really intended to be versioned. And this is a huge problem because reconfiguring or restoring the configuration of a previous build or duplicating a configuration of a build in another environment is actually not possible. You just need to remember all the checkboxes that you selected, or in this case, screenshot it and take it around, right? So that's not really the way we want to go. And one another problem is, of course, automation, right? So if you cannot generate this code, you cannot provision it, you cannot push it. It makes, of course, your it limits a lot what you can do with your CI. Again, there are ways around it. You can kind of hack with those XML files, but it's really ugly and not intended to that. So those three actually bring us to the conclusion that Jenkins one, Hudson and then Jenkins one, as they existed, weren't actually DevOps ready. And this is where the um, change came. It was 2016 when Jenkins Pipeline became the default in Jenkins 2, and that's actually a proper DSL for defining CI builds, and it's kind of a win-win because it's flexible. You write code, it's a DSL written in Groovy, and it's still declarable. It is extendable by plugins, and we're going to talk about that today as well. And your source file live with your code. This is how it is designed. So it's versionable, it's branchable. You can do PR pull requests for that, and all the good stuff that we have with that. Right, and its configuration as code is something that we really love, and of course have special importance in the age of DevOps. So what we did in the Artifactory plugin is extending this DSL configuration, and it's all open source. You can navigate it. You can see how the different objects extending the Jenkins pipeline configuration and which objects can you use, which properties of those objects. It's all there. It's all open, and of course you can use it in code. And those are the big news of Jenkins pipeline. So let's see how we configure a Maven build with Artifactory and Jenkins pipeline plugin. So let me switch to my browser real quick here, and now you see my Jenkins, right? So we have a Maven example here, and before we run it, let's see how it is configured. So it is a pipeline job. I added some parameters in order for me to be able to configure it. It comes from GitHub, and then I have parameters of should I clean the repository, which Artifactory should I use, and which Maven should I use, and that's basically all. All the rest comes from the source file, and this is the repository. This is the repository URL. So I'm just going to copy paste it, and we are going to look at our Jenkins file. It should be right here. Here it is. So that's our Jenkins file, and it configures the Maven build. So it's not a very canonical or maybe not very ideal Jenkins file because we use, I personally used here an imperative approach and not declarative approach. I wrote script instead of using those DSL constructs, and I did it on purpose because I wanted to share with you how what it actually does. So it's kind of a low level. So it has four stages: the setup, the cleanup, the build, and the deploy. And the setup is where I configure those objects that come from Artifactory plugin DSL. So I configure here an Artifactory server referring to the property I defined in my build that you saw previously. I configure the build info, and we're going to talk about build info in a moment. And then I say something like I want to capture the environment variables, and you will see why that's important as well, and which Maven tool should I use. And then I start to configure my build. I say the artifacts should be resolved from libs release and lib snapshot, and should be deployed into libs release local and lib snapshot local, depending on which type of build do I have. right? And then I say, I don't want to deploy them right away. I will defer the deployment to a proper stage in my build. Cleanup, again, I use this property that I defined earlier, and here is where the flexibility of the pipeline come in. I can just write code and I can say something like, if the flag is checked, delete the M2 repository because I want a clean build. If the flag is not checked, the whole this part is skipped, and then I can continue further. Right, there are more elegant ways to do it in the declarative pipeline. I can actually depend a stage on a certain variable, and that's of course the proper way to do it. But again, I wanted to show you that it is actually code, and you can write here structs like if, but don't do that at home. Next will be build, and the build will be one line. Maven, that's our Maven which works with Artifactory, run this POM file and do clean install. And then don't forget to update this build info bill of materials object as you do it. So after we run that, we will have a Maven build that was successfully finished, and we will have a build we will have a bill of materials object filled with information about this build. And the last stage will be deploy. And I say deploy the artifacts that you can know which artifacts to deploy from the same build info object, and then publish the build info itself. So this is all my build. And going back to Jenkins, where is it? Is it here? No, that's the user guide. Okay, here it is. And going back to my Maven build, I just ran it an hour ago. So instead of running it, let's just look what happened. So we have this, let's look at the log first. This is our console output, and we see here the downloading of all the artifacts from our Artifactory, right? It's just being Maven downloading the internet, and then it runs bunch of those modules, eventually finishing the build stage and starting the deploy stage right here. So it will deploy all the artifacts in one bunch, atomic deploy, and then it will deploy the build info, and build is successfully deployed. I have here the URL that I can follow, or another option, I can use this button. So clicking on this button will take me, did I do that? Now I do. Clicking on this button will take me to Artifactory. And here in Artifactory, I will find myself inside the build browser. And build browser is where I actually can see the details of this build, how it was built, by whom it was built, the URL back to Jenkins, where we just came from, and then the list of published modules. In the list of published modules, all those modules that are published are visible, and I can dive into any one of them and see which artifacts were deployed, POM1 file, and which dependencies were deployed, which was used. I have 25. Now, remember this capture environment variables. This is extremely important because I actually captured all the environment variables that were active during the build. And now I can use those environment variables to troubleshoot the build if I have any problems. For example, I want to know which Java version were used when I actually did that. And I can go and I can say Java and see here that that's the Java version that I used during my build. I can compare builds. I can say, what's the difference between build number 24 and build number 23? And I will get the difference in the artifacts. Well, all the artifacts were new, the POMs didn't change, and then I can see that the dependencies, the only one that was updated was the internal dependency, and then I can see that the environment variables, the changed ones, were actually all about local to this build, so there is no change as well. So probably those builds are kind of the same. This is the build with Maven and the Artifactory pipeline plugin, and let's get back to slides for the rest of the fun. And now, before we're going to the next step of our demo, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the age of binaries. And this is what we call the situation today. So as you can see here, starting about new millennial, any development in software engineering approaches generates more and more binaries. It started with agile, in which means we have very short sprints that generate files. Of course, it brings with it the CI. That means that for every push to the CI server, you generate the whole build with all the binaries that it has, and then continuous delivery, in which every artifact you generate, you have to save it because it goes to production. And then DevOps, which basically means all your hardware now are also software artifacts, and we have virtual machine images, which now represent a whole different silo of the organization. And then microservices, which means the more binaries you have, generally the better, because now you have a lot of small services, and every one of them is artifact by itself. And of course, Docker nailed it when every smallest change in your Docker file generates a new layer, generates a new binary, which means every line in code generates a new binary. What else do we have here? Is that so that brings the importance of metadata. And metadata is critical when you have such a huge selection of binaries to answer three basic questions. How do you find the needle in a haystack of binaries? What is deployed where? I have tons of binaries flying around, laying around in my repository, in my pipelines, in my environments. What is deployed where? Tracing binaries to the sources, I have a binary now in place that I need to understand how it was built, because I need to understand what the problem were. And the problem might be, for example, a problem in source, or a problem in environment, or problem in pipelines. All of those should be tracked somehow. We need to pick the right one to go through the pipeline. How, of all the binaries that I have, I select those that need to be promoted, that need to go from the development all the way to production. How do I select that? So those questions are very hard to answer, and for that you have to have this metadata, and you have to have a good way to work with them. And that's a proper way to add metadata, the proper automatically from your CI server, basically, where this metadata is created, or custom metadata, right? So as we mentioned, every step in our pipeline adds additional metadata. So integration test passed, we want to make sure that this binary is marked with proper metadata. Compatibility with browsers works on Chrome and Safari, but doesn't work in Internet Explorer. This has to become a part of binary metadata. Targeted platform architectures and all that. Implicit metadata, stuff like normal stuff of a file, like a size, how many times it was downloaded, who is the author, what are the permissions, all that. All this is actually the same, is the metadata that we need to know. And then we're coming to consuming this metadata. How can we analyze it? And there are different options. So Artifactory has a whole a standalone query language, which allows you to run queries on this metadata and combine any of them. So you can say, for example, give me only the artifacts from a certain build name, and the build name comes from Jenkins, and that passed a certain level of QA. For example, it's ready for staging, and it is actually and it's bigger than 10 gigabytes. I don't know why, but this is something that you can do as well, right? So you can combine all those types of metadata together in query languages and getting the exact right results. So here is the reference for the documentation. Generally, Googling Artifactory query language will take you to the right place. We are going to look on one of the aspects of using this metadata today, and we're going to talk about tracing the builds to their sources. So, answering two questions. Um, I will use Docker just for the sake of the example, and because it is not usually easy to answer those questions with Docker, so we will aim to the hardest part. How do you know which Docker image contains your var, and how do you know what var is in your image that you have in hand? And here I will show you an example of doing that. So let's this time start with my terminal, and I will make it a little bit bigger. And let's say now I have a Docker image that doesn't work well. It came from someone from the team that monitors the production environment came to me and said, Baruch, you know what? The latest image that we have is a piece of crap. And I'm like, okay, let's debug it. Let's see what's wrong with it. By the way, which image do you use? And they're like, well, we are using this one. We are using latest. And that's a completely useless information to me, because in Docker everything can be called latest, and I don't really know which latest is it. So I don't know how to even start debugging it, not even to mention going deep into the application file that I have in my image, or getting to the source of this application in the next step. So this is a hard question to answer. What I can do though is I can run docker inspect on this image. Here you go. And Docker example, latest. And I got all the information about this Docker image. And one of the pieces of information that I have here is the ID. And the ID is actually SHA-2 of this Docker image, which if I build this image with Jenkins that works with Artifactory, I can actually take to my Artifactory instance and run it and try to search for it. So let me go here and do a search. So I will go and run a checksum search. It is a checksum. And I will get a couple of results. So first of all, now I know what the latest refers to. It actually refers to two Docker images, 54 and 55, which basically the same. And those are the Docker images that I've been asked about. So this is a step forward. Now we know at least which Docker images are they, and I can take a look at them in my Artifactory tree here and see what's going on. So I'm looking at 54, and I can see the Docker info. So here I can see all the layers and can understand what was run and which file was run, etc., etc. Okay, so my natural suspicion will be that the application file is bad, right? Because that's the thing that changes the most. Someone updated the application inside my Docker image, and that's what broke. And I see here that this file was added. That's the actual file that my application file, but this is not very descriptive. app.var, I have no idea what that means. I don't know which var is that, or which version of the var is that. I'm not sure what it means. So the good news, or at least it looks like so, that we have a checksum here too. So I can try and search with this checksum. So I'll go again to search and do that. And now I don't have any results. And the reason I don't have any results is that the checksum that Docker shows me, it's not really the checksum of the file. Instead, it's a checksum of a Docker layer, which are not the same thing. So I am back to be puzzled about which application file is it. And this is exactly where the metadata helps me doing this traceability between the two. So what I need to do here is going back to my build, and now I'm going to look at the Docker build. So Docker builds are connected in exactly the same way as Maven builds from my Jenkins to Artifactory with the build info, and I will going to show you a configuration of them in a second. And here, when I can observe my Docker builds. So luckily, the build names and the tags of the Docker images are the same. So if you remember, we spoke about build image 54, and I can look at the build image 54. Now, in the modules of this build image, I will see my dependency to a war file, and that will be this one. And here in the dependencies, I will find this war file already named normally. Well, normally it's a little bit of overstatement because it is actually a Maven snapshot, and that means that still I am not sure which version is it. But the good news are that I can go to the tree to Artifactory, and now here, from here, I can know which build it was a part of. And here I'm going to get back to the context of the build info of my Java build that we used in previous example. And from here, I can deep dive to build number 24, go to Jenkins and see what the revision of the code was build there, check the console output of this build, and that's what we are already looked at, and understand how it went there. So using this metadata that I spoke about, I actually managed to establish this two-directional connection between my Docker image build and my Java build. And even in the worst scenario, when I got an image with a latest tag, which is basically useless, I was able to find the exact line of code that was changed in the Java build in the Java code that triggered the build that went all the way to this image in Docker. And this is pretty cool. The last thing I want to speak with you about is the promotion. And getting back to this partial image of ours that we care about today, I'm going to talk about the last step of today's scope, and that's the contributing metadata to allow the promotion. And I'm not going to demonstrate today any integration between QA tools with Artifactory properties. That's a great topic for another webinar. Today, we're going to talk about another very important contributor to to this part, and that will be a JFrog Artifactory. Now, JFrog Artifactory serves as another metadata source for my decision whether artifacts should be promoted or not, and that's exactly where what we are going to talk about now. Before we are doing that, I will just want to remind you that it will be much easier if you um, enter the questions in the Q&A tab and not in the chat tab, because there is a lot of chatter going on in the chat tab and it's hard for me to find your questions later. So if you want me to answer them, please use the Q&A tab instead. Thank you. Getting back from this technical issue to our promotion story, let's show some Dilbert, because it's already 45 minutes in and we still didn't see any Dilbert videos, any Dilbert comics, so it's about time, right? So I made a slight change here. I tried to look it as I didn't, but I failed, but that's okay. So I will let you a couple of seconds to read and get some laugh about that, and then we will talk about how we actually solve that in another ways. So yes, so the question is how from one side you can guarantee the license and the quality, and from other side not compromise on what your developers use. And taking it from another perspective, um, here is another scenario. You have to deliver a third-party licenses report, and your boss comes to you and say, okay, you have third-party licenses report, and release is still next week. So generate me the subject. And you start to search and you find a bunch of outdated, broken, inactive plugins that try to do so. And eventually, even if you manage to find some way to generate those reports, now you find something and you need to rewrite everything because one of your core um, components um, are not allowed to use anymore. So that's a big problem because the release is still next week. So the question is, how can you do that? The same with security. Like so security is very, very important, and you shouldn't allow vulnerable components to get into your software. But from the other side, you shouldn't feel like the process stands in your way. You shouldn't feel like there is a firewall between your creativity and your and the organization will stop you to do the right thing. And this is where another tool of JFrog comes to the rescue, and this is the JFrog X-Ray. And JFrog X-Ray is a universal artifact binary analysis tool that scans your uh, scans your component tree that exists in JFrog Artifactory for the issues that your organization cares about. And that's, of course, security, licenses, versions, and that comes built in X-Ray in what we call internal metadata sources, but also you can plug in external metadata sources, external vulnerabilities providers, or maybe something that you care about in performance, on runtime bugs, or architectural decisions like outdated components or prohibited components. And all the artifacts in Artifactory, which are a tree, because as in our example, we have a Docker image, inside we have a servlet container, inside we have a war file, inside we have our jar files, and in any level of those, any of those concerns should be found and scanned. So this is what X-Ray does, and it actually brings you the best of two worlds. From one side, it keeps the developer creative, and you as a developer can do whatever you need, and there will no firewalls between you and your productivity. You can go to the internet, select the component that looks right to you, and write code around it. You don't need now to wait 2 weeks to white list this component and to go to legal and bring them the licenses to verify whether they are actually an open source and allowed or not. But from the other side, it also allows you to catch the problems fairly early. And CI build is early because if you do your build after each commit and you commit as often as you should, a couple of hours after the developer wrote the first line of code around this component, you will get actually the notification that something went wrong. So this is how the integration between X-Ray Artifactory and Jenkins work. So you're a developer, you write your code, and then you deploy your code to the source control, We saw this part already, and then Jenkins kicks in, pulls the software, pulls the code, and builds it. So far, that's exactly the diagram that we saw earlier. And after a build, it deploys the successful build with the bill of materials to developer repository. And this is exactly where X-Ray kicks in, analyzing the artifacts that you just deployed. It will find all the problems in all the components that are there. And if there are problems, this information will be reported back to Jenkins, and Jenkins will take the decision whether the next step, which is a promotion of the build, should happen or not. Well, sorry about that. That was too early. Before we are going to show how it actually works. So going back to our Jenkins, now let's take a look at this Docker build that we used the information from it previously and see how it is configured. So I'm going to look at the configuration again. And here I will see exactly the same thing. It is a pipeline job. So it comes from GitHub. We have a couple of parameters here, including the parameter should the build fail if problems are found in X-ray. And then we have our Jenkins file that we are going to look at it now. Whoa, that's not what I meant. Let's go back to my Jenkins, and I lost it again. Here, I wanted to copy all that and paste it here. Okay, so now we're going to look at the Jenkins file inside Docker example, and here is our Jenkins files, and it's a little bit longer than the previous one, but still not a big deal. So here you can see what is going on. We have a couple of stages. The setup works as well. The only difference now is that I also configure the scan config to work with X-ray, and I configure my JFrog CLI to perform the promotion if I decide to go this way. Next stage will be downloading dependencies, and this is where I download the application file that I need to put into my Docker image. I use a download spec for that, and this download spec is another file in the same directory. So let me show you this file as well. Here, download spec, and these download specs say go to lib snapshot and find the latest war file from a Maven example. This is, remember the dependency between the Maven build and Docker build? This is how it's established. And save it without the directory structure into a app.war file in the war directory. Going back here, I'm going to use this spec. I'm going to use this spec to download it. And once it's downloaded, I'm ready to run my Docker build. And here is my Docker build as well. And that's another very simple file. It actually has 4 lines. I use some kind of base that I own, and then I add this file from war, app.war, the one that I just saved, and I put it into where Tomcat is expect it to find, and then I just run Tomcat. Very, very basic stuff. So I build this Docker image, and next step will be I deploy this Docker image to Artifactory. I use Artifactory server to push it, tag it, and also pass all the build info, and that's the build info of the Docker image that we saw. And I collect all the environment variables at this point of time and save them in the build info, pushing the build info as well. So here I pushed my Docker image to a development environment. Next will be triggering the X-ray scan. So here I have my X-ray scan, and I say Artifactory, run server scan. I run it, and then I print the results. And if the flag in the properties that I want to fail on X-ray and the scan result finds something vulnerable, then I want to fail my build with an error message explaining why it actually failed. If that didn't happen, my build will continue through, get to the promotion stage, and then actually run JFrog CLI to promote this artifact to Docker prod from Docker dev. And this is where, if I have some problems in my Docker build, X-Ray is actually going to stop it. So let's run this build real quick, and we will run it with the failure this time. So going back to Jenkins here, I want to run my Docker example, and I do want it to fail if X-Ray finds any problems. And let's take a look at it. Gets the Jenkins file. And now sets up everything, downloads the JFrog CLI. That's for promotion that unfortunately won't happen, because we will find bad stuff in this build. I can guarantee that. And then we build it, tag it, push it to Artifactory, collect the build info, push it to Artifactory as well, and then run the build scan. What you see here are the results of the X-ray scan, and it apparently have tons of issues. And now promotion skipped due to earlier failures, and build failed because Docker example number 56 was scanned by X-ray and alert was generated. So we can go to X-ray and look at this alert. So this is X-ray. I get new alert was generated. I can go to it, and I can see here a whole zoo of vulnerabilities that. Okay, I have an echo. Okay, now it's good. That was generated out of this build, and I can see here, for example, that this one was in struts2, that was inside my war file, what was inside of one of the Docker layers, what was inside a Docker image, that was inside my Docker example build number 56. And I can go here real quick to the components view and see my build Docker example, dive into it, see again all the vulnerabilities, and going all the way down to the layers, find the layer with the up file and find the struts vulnerable component here and look at it to see that it is critical. There are a bunch of problems with it, but the good news, of course, that a latest version was already published, and chances are it solved all the problems right here. So this is X-ray, and this is how they integrate. And of course, what I will see now in Artifactory is that I have this artifact that we just built in Docker Dev Local. Let me zoom here as well. Number 56, but not in Prod Local. Only 55 here because it wasn't promoted all the way. So getting back to just one more slide here, and that's where I want to welcome you all to come and meet us at Jenkins World that happens next week. We will be there. My colleague Mark Galpin, Senior Solution Architect, will give a talk about IoT with Artifactory in Jenkins, a little bit of spin around native code, Conan, C++, and IoT. You can actually get 20% off discount sponsored by us, by JFrog, by using this discount code, and you will get the link in the follow-up email that we will send. And another unique a proposal for you, the attendance of this webinar, is actually meeting technical architects and the leadership team, including our CTO and sorry, not CTO, including our chief solution architects in one-on-one meetings. So again, just email to webinars@jfrog.com, and we will be able to schedule those meetings for you. With that, I don't have a lot of time for questions, but let's try to do at least some. I will keep going, and if you have another meetings, of course, that's a good reason to leave. If you want to stick around for the questions, that will be awesome as well. So first, a question I really like. It says, "Thank you," and you're very welcome. Next. Um, Is it possible to actually rebuild based on the build info? That would be really cool. And that's a very interesting question. Let me kind of rephrase it and maybe elaborate a little bit about it. So build info looks like it has all the information to run exactly the same build. And the question is, can we actually use this build info to rerun the build? And the answer is unfortunately no, because there are a lot of moving parts in your build that we don't know. We capture the snapshot of the environment, what was used as dependencies de facto, what passed through the wire, and which artifacts you generated, again, what passed through the wire. But the logic of your build tool is a complete black box to us. So we won't be able to give you the ability to rebuild. The good news are that if you managed your artifacts well enough, you don't need to rebuild, because all the artifacts that you used and all the dependencies that were used to create these artifacts are cached in Artifactory, and you can always get back to that instead of redoing that. I hope that answers the question. Does Artifactory plugin works when building using Java JDK 6? As I understand, it requires at least JDK 7. That actually, I don't have an answer right on top of my head now. I will make sure to answer to get back to you with your question. So let me copy paste it here and put it somewhere that I can get back to you, and I will make sure that we will reply. Okay. Next one. The binary variations can also be from variable dependencies, including transitive dependencies. And that, I think, going back to how reliable, what can we learn from the information from build info. And when I mentioned that one of the problems might be, for example, a different Java version, and here is another comment from one of the listeners, that the problem can also be because the dependencies changed, including transitive dependencies. And that's, of course, correct. And the build info includes all the information about the dependencies. So as I showed you here, and I can show you right here again real quick, if you go to any of your builds, you can see the dependencies captured, and then if any of the dependencies changed, you can see them right here, or you can see them when you compare with another build. So here you have all the list of dependencies, and you can see whether anything changed. But that's a great question. Thank you. Can we another question is, can we trace the history of metadata? If I mark something as production, but then I roll back, it is recorded automatically, or do I need to have custom scheme for that? That's also a very good question, and the example is very relevant. How do I trace the state of this metadata when it goes promoting from stage to stage? So the metadata is stored in the database, so it's not like it's a source file that can be managed and revisions. So what I would do is keep a track of those metadata entries, not overriding them, but adding them one to another. And then you can see the history of what actually happened. How do I mark an artifact bad with SonarQube quality gate false? And that's another great question, and it goes back to this slide. Let me jump back to it. Right where it was here. Right here. Now you can see the slide. Here. So we have SonarQube here, and it should contribute metadata to Artifactory. And the question is, okay, how does it work? And there are many ways of adding metadata to Artifactory. What tools like SonarQube will usually use is just a REST API. So you can issue a REST API query, put query, that will add metadata on a certain artifact. And this is how you market bed. What if Jenkins has the history removed? How you trace back to Git revision? That's another great question, and it actually proves the importance of having Artifactory. So Jenkins is not a database, is not a system of record. Sometimes we prune the history of builds, we remove them all, and that makes our link to Jenkins useless. And if the link to Jenkins useless, the question is, okay, how do we get to the source code? And here the environment variables can really help you, because the environment variables captured all this information for you, and this information is where the artifacts are. This information is safe. If you nuke your Jenkins completely, this information is not going everywhere. And I believe that environment variables here have the revision maybe in the system variables, but somewhere I believe it is recorded. Oh, maybe it's called something different. I'm pretty sure you can find it here in the environment variables. And if not, you can add it as environment variable. You can take it from Jenkins as a variable and make sure that it is passed into the build info of Artifactory when you do it, and then you will actually be saved. I'm a little bit surprised that it's not here. I would expect it to be here. But yeah, there is a very simple way to pass it here and then save it in the metadata in build info. Okay. How do we mark an artifact as bad when automatic test fails? I think I already added that. A pull request, REST API that marks an artifact as bad. Is metadata easily queryable from REST API? And that's a good, very good question as well. And that's something that I didn't show you. If you go here to the last tab, build info JSON, you will see how all this metadata is actually passed. And that's a JSON object. And you can see here the properties, and down the road you can see the artifacts and all the dependencies. All the information is actually recorded as a JSON object. This JSON object first queryable by itself. You can just get it and parse it and find whatever you like. But also the Artifactory query language can provide you a query language of top of this, where you can actually do like a reasonable queries instead of parsing the JSON on the client side. So you can use either of those or both, and of course automate this metadata, and that's very important. And thank you for asking. How can I make Jenkins download artifact from JFrog to use it as input for the build? And I think that was asked before I actually showed my Docker example build. And getting back to my Docker example build, I have exactly this scenario here in download dependencies. So using this download spec that I showed you previously, which configures which files need to be downloaded to use as inputs or as dependencies, and then I just run them. I just run a download command. And the good news are that if I provide the build info object to this command, the information about those downloaded files will be recorded as dependency, and this multi-build link that I mentioned will be established automatically. The fact that I pass here this build info actually allows me to see this dependency in my Docker example. So here in the published modules, the fact that I know about this file is because I passed this, because I passed it. Yeah, so, and the guys here helped me to with my struggle finding the revision number. It is in the environment variables, so I just probably search for the wrong name. So let's try Git maybe. No. Okay. Well, it's somewhere there, and maybe I will follow up with finding it, but it's definitely there. Okay, so that was the example of how you download the dependency, and not only you download the dependency, you actually can trace it back to the build info. So okay. What else do we have there? Are there any plans to implement webhook on Artifactory upload? Well, the good news are we have a webhook on Artifactory upload, and that's of course the Artifactory user plugins. Artifactory user plugins are much more powerful than a webhook. It allows you to react on a bunch of events and even do something actively by using REST API. So of course we have an event on Artifactory upload in which you can implement any kind of logic, including calling third-party systems with any properties or any parameters that you like. So take a look at that. It's extremely powerful. Okay, what else do I have? Will Artifactory Jenkins plugins is supported in the future for pipeline jobs? Well, that's a weird question because everything that we saw today were pipeline jobs. So the answer is not only in the future, it already works with it. Open source compliance. Does it mean that Extra performs open source compliance? The answer is yes, of course. We saw an example of a tool that of a build that failed over a bunch of security vulnerabilities, but it's exactly the same with open source compliance. If you define your licenses as compliant or not compliant, then your builds will fail in exactly the same way. Right here, banned and valid, I don't have any banned licenses, but if I had some, then the build would the build will fail in exactly the same way on the license compliance as it did on security vulnerabilities. Is Black Duck as external provider for JFrog Extra? Yes, and I'm glad that this idea of external providers resonated in exactly the same direction. So if I go here in X-Ray to my integrations, I can see here that I can add Black Duck as an external provider for the information for X-Ray. So we already answered that. Does the pipeline method now allow you to specify your build parameters within the pipeline script? It looks like it is implied that you still have to manually set up those. I'm not sure I understand the question. Specify your build parameters within pipeline script. I guess I need some more information before I can answer that. Is it better to scan artifacts before adding it to Docker image? Yes, but then you will only scan the Java artifacts. And in our example, the vulnerable component that I showed you was indeed inside the Java build, but I bet this build also had tons of issues in the Docker image as well. So if I am going to look at the Docker example, I will see here bunch of artifacts, bunch of problems which not necessarily come from struts. So here, for example, an issue in my Debian, in one of my Debian packages, right? So not only in Java, a bunch of them actually, 3 of them. So scanning only Java will give you partial results because you didn't scan the Debian packages and there was a problem right there. Okay, what else do we have? Wow, that's a lot of questions. Okay, so before we continue, let me just ask you another question. And for that, I will quickly run another poll. And my question would be, what do you want to see? What do you want to see next? We do bunch of webinars, and it's really important for us to know what your preference is. Do you want more in-depth Artifactory webinars? Maybe you want more X-ray, maybe you want to concentrate on Docker. How about IoT, C++, Conan with Artifactory and Bintray? Or if you have any additional ideas, please use the chat window for that as well. Provide us with more information. So you know what? I'll just keep this polling running, and I'll keep answering the questions in the meanwhile. Can I provide you with URL of Docker example that you showed? Yes, the follow-up email that we will send will contain all the links to this. It's actually one GitHub repository with the Jenkins files, build Docker files, and all the additional information that you need. So we will take care of that as well. Another question, is it better to process the build of artifact in a Docker image or outside of an image and then copy to the image's Docker build? And the later result we did. We have two different builds, Java and Docker, and then put one into another. We see a lot of examples when they're all made inside the same build. So you kind of finish with Java and you take the war file, you are in Jenkins, you have the war file right there, and pack it in Docker. It's actually up to you. Having multiple builds is more flexible. The downside of it would be not being able to correlate one with another. But of course, when you use Artifactory, that's not an issue anymore because you can establish links between the builds, and then you kind of solve this problem. So it's really up to you, and it depends on how what makes sense in your environment. With Artifactory, you have the freedom to do both without losing the connection. Does X-ray scan the code at build time or the build artifact afterwards? Can it do both? Well, we do, in general, we are the binary people here in JFrog. We care about binaries. We scan the binaries. We don't scan the source code. There are other tools to do that, like HP45 and Black Duck. One of their solution. The name escaped now, but there are different tools that scan the source code. We don't do that. We analyze the binaries recursively to find any possible binary inside, and then we can scan them for different issues, etc. Are there any plans to implement Artifactory API in Jenkins plugin to avoid the SH and curl, etc. external calls? Well, that's a good question, and we do have some of it already implemented. And let me go back to my Docker build here. That's the Java build. Here's the Docker build. So this command, the RT server download, is an example of such a DSL that actually runs curl behind the scenes. So it allows you to download artifacts from Artifactory without doing SH and curl, etc., etc. Another trick that I used, and maybe it makes sense to kind of add it to DSL as well, and that's a very good idea. I think I will be more than happy to provide this feedback to the product teams, is integrating the JFrog CLI into that as well. So you can see here, I kind of use here NSH to run it now, and that's not a very good way to do the to use the DSL. And actually running JFrog CLI as a part of a DSL is actually a brilliant idea. So yeah, thank you for that. Does X-ray scan Android APK files? Not at the moment. At the moment, we do only for Java normal Java files, but the compatibility of X-ray with different package types continues to increase, and we aim to support all the types that we support in Artifactory and X-ray as well as soon as possible. Is extra available as an add-on license to Pro and Pro Plus customers? Well, all the licensing information is on our website. I'm not in sales myself, so I will avoid this question. The website is for your service, and of course, our sales team at sales@jfrog.com will be more than happy to take that. Do you have an API to get metadata information about Docker build, latest image, etc., etc.? Well, what we do have is the information about an image, right? So we know which images are inside Artifactory. And if you have deployed more than one image to Artifactory, of course, you can see that as well. And we have a full REST API that will give you the whole list of Docker images existing in Artifactory. It's just a file list on a folder can give you that, and we have REST API for that as well. How is your build info generated during a Maven build? Is it based on downloads from JFrog or is it within Maven? That's a great question. How this magic works, where the information comes from, and I think we have two different answers to that, and that depends on technology. If we implement build info for a technology which is extendable, such as, for example, Gradle for Java, or even Maven to some extent, we had to do some dirty tricks, but eventually we managed to extend it. Then we can go to the tool itself and monitor the tool. This is what we do for Maven. So let's see if I have this here. Let's go back to Maven example. I wanted to show you something in the logs. So let's go to 24 here and see the console output. Full log, I want to show you where it starts, right here. So when we start working, we actually run Maven with our own plugin. We replace some, we add some jars to the class path, and then when the plugin kicks in. Once we do that, we know how to monitor Maven from within. We know how to monitor this build info from within. Not all the tools are as open as Gradle and not even as Maven. So for example, for Docker, there are no plugins. The only way to analyze what's going into Docker and what's going out of Docker is actually monitor the build itself. And for that, we implemented the proxy inside Jenkins, inside our plugin that monitors the network and actually knows what are the dependencies, and that means what we downloaded, and what are the artifacts, and that means what we uploaded. So that's the answer. It depends, but we do our best to do it anyhow. What else? Is it possible to publish Maven builds without using Artifactory Maven and use my own Maven version coming from my own Docker image in an automatic way? Well, that goes back exactly to what I mentioned now. We need a way to instrument Maven in order to monitor it. Your own Maven version is of course possible because our Maven example uses the Maven that is provided, our Maven integration uses the Maven that we provide here inside the Jenkins file. So you can provide here your own Maven and we will know how to instrument that and do our magic. So there is a very simple way to do that. And here is a very nice request about Artifactory and Ansible webinar. I guess we will do one. We are now working on official Ansible recipe, I think it's called in Ansible, maybe, to start up Artifactory and work on Artifactory. Once this work is done, we will definitely have this webinar. It would be great if developers would know they should not use a library while they add it to the project. Are any plans to provide Eclipse or Visual Studio plugin for doing that? Thank you for asking this wonderful question, because we actually do have a plugin, and we have a JFrog plugin for IntelliJ IDEA, which does exactly that. Once you add a new dependency, it will be scanned by X-ray, and the developer will get a notification about not using this dependency while they add it into the IDE. So the answer is yes, that's even better, and we actually have that. Does Extra propose a way how to fix the issues that were found, like which version of library we should upgrade? That's again very good question. We are working now, and it will be released very soon, on the recommendations engine inside the X-ray that will provide a remedy for the problems that are found. So yes. Another question, and from someone who uses build info. Build info can have multiple statuses. Does AQL return builds with older status or just the latest one? So we're talking about promotion pipeline, in which build info can go through different phases of promotion from one to another, and currently AQA only gives you the builds which are in the status you are asking about. So what it will require you is building a little bit of complicated query, adding to the results all the statuses that you actually care about. In X-ray, is it possible to ignore certain issues where there is no newer version of dependency? Yes, of course. All that is configurable. You can ignore issues. You can mark issues as to be ignored, and they won't trigger alerts. Thanks for the webinar. How do I get X-ray? Do we need a new license? So the easiest way is go to jeffrog.com/xray, download the trial, play with it, and then we will contact you to see what will be the best way to proceed. Is there a way to associate dependence artifact with a build outside the scope of the plugin? Example given, if the build is a virtual machine, how do I can associate all download packages with the published artifacts? That's another good question, and I love those questions which ask how do we add more metadata, because it is that critical. You do want to add as much metadata as possible, and the very simple way to do it is by REST API. So let's say all those dependencies are produced with the same build in Jenkins. You can mark them all with some property using the Artifactory Jenkins plugin. You just want to add metadata to existing artifact. It will be a REST pull request that will add this information. You can use JFrog CLI to do all that. You don't need to learn, go and figure it out, the pesky little details of every REST API detail. You can use JFrog CLI tool and then use commands like add property to annotate the artifacts that you care about with the metadata that will make sense to all of you. So that's a very good question as well. Does the pipeline plugin requires a pro license for pushing to the repository? No, the pipeline plugin is completely open source. Of course, it works with Artifactory open source version. The information that you will see in the UI will be limited. You won't see the dependencies and the diffs and this kind of stuff, but everything will work. The build info will be deployed with the artifacts and will be in Artifactory, queried by REST API, and basically you can do your own thing with that. So yes, it works with open source. Is there any way to taking snapshots of artifact repositories? I'm not sure what you mean by snapshots. You can export the repositories, and maybe that's what you mean, if you want to elaborate. Okay, what else? Is there a plugin for Kubernetes to talk with Artifactory? The answer is yes. There are a lot of ways how to integrate Kubernetes with Artifactory. First of all, you can set up Artifactory on Kubernetes very simply. We have examples of how to do that. Secondly, Artifactory is a Docker registry, a standard Docker registry, and that means that Kubernetes can pull the Docker images from it. And third, Artifactory also is a Helm repository, which means that you can pull the Helm charts from Artifactory and have a universal repository for both your Docker images and your Helm charts in one tool with, as you now remember, metadata that kind of connects one to another. What is the recommended way to clean up to clean snapshots in Artifactory? There are a bunch. For tools like Maven, in which what is snapshot is very well defined, we do it for you. You set up cleanup policy, you say I want to keep 10 latest snapshots, and we will take care of the rest. For others, in which kind of what is snapshot is ambivalent and you decide what is snapshots for you, there are at least 3 different ways. You can write a script that would use our CLI to delete some files periodically. You can write a user plugin that we will clean up the artifacts based on your logic, and will retain only the artifacts that need to be retained. Or you can write a script that just uses REST API and clip them as well. You can use our Java API for that, or any other way of doing it. So basically, it's up to you. Can X-ray block JVM-based artifacts that have transitive snapshot dependencies? Oh, I love this question. Yes, so transitive dependencies is a big no, and the good in production environments, transitive dependency snapshots. And the good answer is that you don't need X-ray. You don't need X-ray for that. You can specify your Jenkins to only retrieve artifacts from your release repositories, and then it will fail on trying to retrieve artifacts from snapshot repositories, and it will actually do the job. What else? How does X-ray handle issues with no resolution? So I already mentioned, at the moment we will have soon recommendations engine that will provide an kind of way to resolve the issue. But X-ray by itself is an alerting, and what it can do, it can send you an email, call any system of yours, or fail the build. It won't fix the dependencies for you in your Docker file or your POM XML. This is something that you will always have to do by yourself. So X-ray doesn't handle issues with resolution or without it. We can warn, we can act, but we cannot replace the bad artifact with good one in your dependency management, obviously. What else do we have here? Couple of proposals for additional webinars. Thank you for that. Using the Artifactory plugin, is possible to create a pipeline for remove or purge artifacts from Artifactory? Yes, of course. You saw how we used Artifactory JFrog command line tool from the pipeline. In exactly the same way, you can issue any delete commands using the file spec or the AQL and delete whatever you like from Jenkins. It will just run a JFrog CLI with the right parameters. Is it possible to clean up the dev repository and failed build after promoting a successful build for the next repository? Yes, of course. So let me try and imagine the scenario that you are saying. So let's say we have a build and it failed. It wasn't promoted. It's still in dev. And then we run another build, and this time it was promoted. And now, since we have a newer build, which is both in dev and in prod, I want to delete the older failed build. And that's, of course, again, should be done from Jenkins itself. It will be probably the next step after the promotion. And I will go like iterate through the builds that I have, find the ones which are only in dev and not in prod, and delete them using my Artifactory, my JFrog CLI tool. So yeah, that's what I would do. To build a Docker image in the pipeline example you showed, are you using a plugin for that, especially in the example where you called docker.build? Well, I didn't use any plugins for that, and you can see here that I have a very simple Docker file of 4 lines, and I build it using what it is. Is it Maven? No, it's Docker here. So I run here in the build, I run this Docker build command, and this Docker comes from Jenkins Docker plugin. So it's Jenkins, the default Jenkins Docker plugin has nothing to do with that, and I can just build Docker images using that. That's standard Jenkins. So yeah, so I guess the answer is yes, I use the plugin, but not something specific or fancy. It's just Jenkins Docker plugin. Um, how do I use the new build property value in Jenkins to trigger a pipeline job? Ooh, that's an answer. That's a question that I'm not sure how to answer. I guess that will be a good question on Jenkins Stack Overflow. I really not sure how the triggering based on the value change work. I'm pretty sure it can be done. I'm just not sure how. Can X-ray not to fail certain security findings when there is no fix available? So we spoke about that, and you can definitely ignore some issues and say, don't alert me on them. So yes, it works. And this we already answered. More ideas on webinars. I love that. Using current Artifactory API, is it possible to create a Jenkins pipeline to remove? Oh, well, already answered that. Sorry about that. At a high level, how does one get all the project dependencies stored in Artifactory? For example, in my project, we have 20 dependencies. How do I get them into Artifactory because kicking off building Jenkins? Well, so it really depends on the type of your dependence. If you use a dependency manager or dependency tool, such as all this huge list, right? Any of those, they will be resolved automatically from the remote repository. Getting back to my previous slide right here, you will see that on the first build, whether it's done by developer or by CI server, all of them will be resolved from remote repositories automatically for you. They will all be resolved and stored in Artifactory. So there is no special action item that you need to do. If you don't use any dependency manager and your build kind of expect your files to be there, then you can use, of course, the JFrog CLI tool to define download specs of what need to be downloaded in front and where they should reside, and then of course they will be right there. But chances are you do use dependency manager, and if you don't, you really should. And today there are almost no reason not to use one. Any modern programming language have a dependency manager of some sort, and if that's the case, it can be used with Artifactory to automatically populate the dependencies. So we also answered this one. We also answered this one. Oh, okay. Here, people keep helping me with my struggle with finding the revision number, and so it is an environment variable, just not on the first page. So thank you all for helping. Yes, it is there. I know that. I just couldn't find it, but it is there. So now you know as well. It is there. Good. Thank you. Can you generate build info without the Jenkins pipeline? Only with Artifactory plugin in Jenkins. But of course, I showed you the pipeline because we truly believe that that's what you should use. But by all means, absolutely, the good old Jenkins Artifactory plugin that without a pipeline can of course generate the same build info. You have here all the instructions on how to do it, and we saw previously the example of how you configure a Maven build, and you can see it right here. Capture and publish the build info right here, and that means build info will be generated even when you use Maven or a Jenkins plugin without the pipeline. Another interesting question. Can the test results be stored in Artifactory as well? And again, I love this question because you keep going to how do I use Artifactory more to store more metadata, and that's a great question. And the answer for this specific one is yes. All you need to do is deploy the zip with the test results into Artifactory, and then of course correlate it with metadata. You already know how, with the artifacts to which those test results actually relate. How do you recommend promoting Artifactory through many stages? Do you use a separate repository for each stage or a single repository? The answer is yes. Separate repository for each stage. That's the best practice, and it actually works. And the reason is, getting back to one of my favorite diagrams of all times, and this one, you don't see it, now you do. This one, those quality gates, those numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, the harder they are, the better your pipeline will be. That guarantees that non-tested artifacts won't end up in production. And the hardest quality gates one can set up in Artifactory are different repositories, because it's very easy to guard them and make sure that the tools which are, or people which are not allowed to see certain stages, won't actually see those stages. So the answer is yes, yes, separate repositories for sure. All metadata can be read and written to. Is there a way to make some metadata immutable? Yes, so the permission targets in Artifactory, we have a separate permission which is called annotate. And this permission annotating allow you to add metadata. Once you don't have the permission to add metadata, you obviously cannot override it as well. How do you handle pipeline that needs a build of C++ application on multiple operating systems, Windows and Linux, using Conan if possible? So first of all, yes, you should use Conan. And the pipeline will be, you will have two agents, one with Windows, the other with Linux, and they will probably run in parallel because you want to run the same build. You will run Conan on both of them to retrieve the dependencies, and then you will use JFrog CLI to submit all the build binaries to Artifactory. What is your opinion about snapshot builds in continuous delivery? Considering the CD principle that everything is a potential release, it implies snapshot builds are not usable as a release candidate. Well, there are different approaches to the snapshots problem, And I would say if you do continuous delivery, use your build numbers as your versions, as we now did with Docker. It was very easy to us, and I hope very clear to you, when we saw this image number 54 and we saw the build number 54, we knew exactly that they are related, and it actually makes a lot of sense. So build numbers as versions for continuous delivery is probably the easiest way to go, and it makes a lot of sense. Another question about X-Ray integrated with IDE, namely IntelliJ. The answer is it is implemented. It is integrated now. Look for JFrog plugin. I did a screencast a couple of weeks ago about it, and take a look at it. It does exactly what you expect it to do. Where do you suggest storing build that is deployed in environment X over time? Is Artifactory a decent place for storing that metadata? Well, the answer is Artifactory is the only place to store this metadata. And that goes back to the question, if you remember, that I asked, what is deployed where? Once you have all the artifacts that you ever deployed to a certain environment in Artifactory, and you have metadata on those artifacts that clearly mark where those artifacts were deployed, and you add this metadata during the deploy, you have this traceability always. You can look at the artifact and you can say, hey, these guys deployed in that environment. And the other way around, you can run an AQL query and say, give me all the artifacts that were ever deployed to a certain environment, or give me the latest artifact that was deployed to this environment. And it usually means it runs there now. What is a good strategy to deploy .exe binary from Jenkins to Artifactory and capture, generate metadata? You have the download and upload commands that I showed you earlier, and they are in the DSL. This one, rtserver.download. We also have rtserver.upload. You provided download upspec or upload upspec, in which you will configure, this is this JSON file, this one, this one, in which you configure which files are selected, and you will have your exe and maybe a bunch of others. And then you do Artifactory server upload. And if you won't forget to provide an empty or partially populated build info object, those artifacts will be added to this build info as artifacts or as dependencies. It is really cool, I have to say, because it means that you can generate build info on whatever you like. You don't need any integration with Jenkins itself. You can specify what are your dependencies, what are your artifacts, and you will have a complete build info for that. Okay, we answered that. We answered that. More ideas for webinars. I love you guys. Thank you very much. When generating a new version of Artifact, do you use MVN version plugin, since that has a lot of overhead? No. The easiest way to do it is very, very simple. The version in POM file can be an environment variable. All you need to do is pass into your Maven file the version, the build number from your Jenkins. You will end up with the same elegant solution that I mentioned earlier when you actually use a build version as your build number as your version in your Maven artifacts. That will work great. You definitely don't need MVN, this horrible MVN version plugin. Ooh, that was. Okay, so and that's a good question. How about dependencies which are already in local Maven cache of Jenkins, I guess? The answer is, if they're also in Artifactory, everything will work great. If they are not yet in Artifactory, then no, Artifactory won't know about them, X-Ray won't know about them, the build info will be partial, etc., etc. You really need to pass them through Artifactory for that. Okay, guys, I think we run like an hour past time, and and that's about time for me to let you go. I'm glad you all been here, and thank you for those wonderful questions. Feel free to keep asking me questions, and I guess Twitter is the easiest way to get to me. If your question won't fit into 140 characters, just don't. No, of course, go ahead and answer, and just point me to another medium that we can talk. JFrog at jbaruch, uh, jbaruch at jfrog.com is my email, and send their emails as well. And with that, we really should wrap this thing up. Thank you very much, and see you in next webinars. Some of them you have just proposed.